The first snow of December clung to the ruts in the road, turning the mud beneath into a half-frozen crust that cracked under every step. Sarah Whitfield pulled her shawl tighter, the icy wind cutting through the worn wool as she adjusted the small bundle of firewood in her arms. The road from the creek to her family's cabin was quiet that morning. Too quiet for a countryside that had grown used to the distant thud of cannons and the occasional column of militiamen passing through. She had learned to tell the difference between the sounds of war and the sounds of life. Today there were neither. The first figure appeared just past the bend in the road. A man slumped over the neck of his horse, blood soaking through the sleeve of his blue coat. The coat alone told her enough. A Continental officer. Behind him, two more riders appeared, one clutching his side, the other nearly sliding from the saddle. The smell of powder and burnt cloth clung to them, mingling with the sharp winter air. The man in front, tall with dark hair matted to his forehead, tried to straighten as the horse staggered to a stop. His gaze locked on her, as if she were the first living soul he'd seen in hours. "You!" His voice cracked. He swayed, gripping the pommel. "Water, please." Sarah dropped her bundle without thinking. The wood clattered onto the icy road as she ran toward the horse, grabbing the reins before the animal could bolt. His gloved hand brushed her shoulder, heavy and trembling. She reached for his arm to steady him and felt the warmth of fresh blood through the wool. "I have to get you off the road," she said, her voice low but urgent. She had no idea where the nearest British patrol might be, but every heartbeat felt like it could bring the sound of boots on frozen ground. The other two soldiers were in no better state. One was barely conscious, the other scanning the trees like a hunted man. "They're behind us," he muttered. "Less than a mile." Sarah's stomach tightened. The war had always been something that happened beyond the horizon. News carried by travelers, rumors whispered over market stalls. But here it was, bleeding in front of her. She led the officer's horse toward the trees, where a narrow deer path cut between frozen brush. The cabin was still a quarter-mile away, hidden beyond a small ridge. If they could just get over that rise, they might buy themselves a few minutes. The officer's weight slumped more heavily against her. She glanced up at him, and for the first time noticed the stars embroidered on his epaulette. 2 of them. "General." Her heart kicked against her ribs. Harboring any patriot officer was dangerous. Hiding a general from the British. That was a hanging offense. She didn't stop moving. By the time they reached the ridge, the sound of distant hoofbeats echoed faintly through the trees. She forced the men onward, guiding them down the slope toward her family's empty tobacco barn. Her father had joined the militia months ago, and her younger brother was away on supply runs. No one was here to tell her it was foolish. No one was here to stop her. Inside the barn, the smell of old hay and dust wrapped around them. She pulled a wool blanket from a storage chest, shaking out the moth scent before draping it over the general's shoulders. His lips were pale, his eyes glassy with fever. "You'll be safe here," she whispered, more to herself than to him. Outside, the hoofbeats grew louder. Sarah's hands trembled, not from the cold this time, but from the certainty that she had just stepped across a line she could never retreat from. The barn felt colder now that the adrenaline had worn off. Sarah could hear the rasp of the general's breathing between the creaks of the wooden beams. A thin shaft of light slipped through a gap in the boards, cutting across his face. His skin was pale, his lips cracked, and every so often his jaw clenched like he was fighting something in his dreams. She crouched beside him, pressing a damp cloth to his forehead. The fever had already set in. She'd seen men die from wounds far less severe. Her father's stories of the last winter's camp had made that clear. From outside came the faint sound of boots crunching over frozen ground. Sarah froze, every muscle taut. Through the slats she caught sight of 2 red-coated soldiers moving along the road, muskets at their shoulders. They didn't stop, but their voices drifted in through the cold air. "Said he was shot near the creek. Won't have made it far." Her chest tightened. They were looking for him. And they weren't guessing, they knew he'd been wounded. When the footsteps faded, she exhaled slowly and looked at the other 2 soldiers she had helped drag inside. One had collapsed into the hay, asleep from exhaustion. The other, a wiry man with a patchy beard, sat upright and watched her with guarded eyes. "You're risking your neck," he said quietly. "They find us here, it won't just be us they hang." "I know," she replied, wringing out the cloth again. "But leaving him in the snow would have been a death sentence." The man's gaze shifted to the general. "That's General Nathaniel Harrow. If he lives, there's a chance this fight in the valley isn't lost." Sarah didn't know much about generals or battles, but she understood that this man mattered far beyond their little patch of farmland. The general stirred, mumbling something incoherent. She leaned closer, catching fragments of words. Orders, names, a river crossing. He was somewhere else entirely in his mind, trapped in the fight that had left him here. She needed medicine. The bullet wound in his shoulder had been roughly bandaged, but the fabric was soaked through with blood. Infection would come fast in this cold. There was only one place nearby to get what she needed, a small apothecary in the next hamlet, run by a Quaker woman who kept her shop neutral in the war. But getting there meant walking straight through the road the British patrolled. The wiry soldier seemed to read her thoughts. "If you go, don't carry anything that marks you as a patriot. They'll question anyone they don't know." Sarah nodded, tucking her hair under a wool cap. "Watch him. If they come back, hide in the loft." She slipped out the barn's side door, the frozen grass crunching under her boots. Every step toward the hamlet felt like walking a tightrope over a drop she couldn't see the bottom of. She kept her eyes down when a British patrol passed, gripping the small basket at her side so tightly her knuckles ached. The apothecary's bell gave a faint chime when she pushed the door open. Warm air and the scent of dried herbs hit her all at once. The woman behind the counter, Mrs. Tillman, met Sarah's gaze for a long moment, then glanced at the basket. "You've got someone hurt," she said quietly, already reaching for jars. "And it's someone you can't let the wrong eyes see." Sarah swallowed. "Yes." Mrs. Tillman packed the medicines in a cloth bundle without another question. As Sarah turned to leave, the older woman caught her sleeve. "Child, whatever you're doing, be sure you're ready to see it through. The British aren't merciful." Sarah nodded, the weight of those words following her all the way back to the barn, where the hoofbeats she'd feared most were already drawing near. By the time Sarah reached the edge of the barn's clearing, the sound of hoofbeats was no longer distant. It was sharp, deliberate, and far too close. She slipped inside and bolted the door behind her. The wiry soldier was already at the window, his eyes dark with warning. "They've seen the tracks," he said. "Won't be long before they're here." The general was still slumped on the blanket, fever burning in his cheeks. Sarah knelt beside him and checked the bandage. Blood had soaked through again. They couldn't stay. If the British searched the barn, they'd all be dead before nightfall. She grabbed the soldier's arm. "Help me get him up. We need to move now." They half lifted, half dragged the general to his feet. Every step drew a low groan from him, but his legs held just enough to keep moving. Outside, the hoofbeats slowed. She could hear muffled voices, then the crunch of boots on snow. The barn had a back exit, a narrow door that opened toward the frozen creek. Sarah led them through, breath coming fast, and they slipped into the thin cover of winter-bare trees. The only way to the ridge beyond was over the old mill bridge, a narrow plank span above icy water. If they crossed, they could vanish into the woods where British horses wouldn't easily follow. But the bridge was already in sight of the patrol. Two redcoats stood on the far side, muskets slung over their shoulders. One spotted them instantly. "Halt!" the soldier barked, starting forward. Sarah's pulse pounded in her ears. She stepped ahead of the general, straightening her spine despite the tremor in her legs. "Please, he's my cousin," she said, pitching her voice high with feigned panic. "He's fevered. We're just trying to get him to the doctor in Fair Hollow." The soldier's eyes narrowed. "Fair Hollow? That's 3 miles the other way." She hesitated, then let her voice break. "I'm afraid of the road. There are men out there." She let her gaze dart behind her as if expecting shadows to appear. Every second she bought was another for the general to regain some strength. The taller of the two redcoats came closer, studying her. "You seem mighty nervous for someone walking to a doctor. What's he hiding under that coat?" Before she could answer, the wiry soldier shifted his stance behind the general, hand resting casually on the musket at his side. Not threatening, but close enough to make the redcoats think twice. Sarah moved between them, blocking their view. "Please," she said, stepping forward until she was squarely in their path. "He won't last the hour. If you delay us, you might as well pull the trigger yourself." Her voice shook, but she didn't move aside. The redcoats exchanged a glance, then stepped back, not out of kindness but calculation. They let her pass, muttering something under their breath. They crossed the bridge quickly, boots thudding against the planks. On the other side, Sarah kept her head down until the patrol was out of sight. Only then did she release the breath she'd been holding. The wiry soldier gave her a sideways look. "You've got steel in you, girl." Sarah didn't answer. She just tightened her grip on the general's arm and kept moving. The night ahead would be long, and she had no idea how much farther her courage could carry them. They didn't stop moving until the woods thinned and the faint light of dawn crept between the trees. The cold had seeped deep into Sarah's bones, but she forced herself to keep pace, the general leaning heavily on her shoulder. Every few steps, his knees buckled, and the wiry soldier caught his other arm, pulling him forward. Finally, they reached a secluded hunting cabin, half collapsed but still standing. Inside, the air was stale and the floor was littered with leaves, but it was shelter. They eased the general down onto a rough cot, covering him with the last dry blanket. Sarah dug through her basket for the medicine Mrs. Tillman had given her and began cleaning his wound. The general's eyes opened for the first time with true clarity. "Where are we?" His voice was hoarse but steadier. "Safe enough," Sarah said, pressing the cloth to his shoulder. "For now." He looked at her for a long moment, taking in the soot-stained shawl, the trembling hands, the dirt smudged across her cheek. "You risked everything for me." Sarah hesitated. Someone had to. The wiry soldier stepped in. "Sir, the valley force is scattered, but if we can get word to the ridge outpost, we might still hold the northern pass." The general's expression hardened. He pushed himself upright with visible effort. "Paper. Anything." Sarah found a small ledger in the cabin and a half-burnt candle stub. By the flickering light, the general scrawled orders, his handwriting jagged from fatigue but urgent. When he finished, he pressed the folded paper into the soldier's hand. "Ride hard," he said. "Do not stop until you reach Captain Warren." The soldier nodded and was gone within minutes, his footsteps vanishing into the snow. When they were alone, Sarah sat beside the general. "Will it make a difference?" He gave a faint, tired smile. "It could turn the whole fight. You didn't just save me, Miss Whitfield. You may have saved every man in this valley." The weight of his words settled over her like the dawn chill. She hadn't thought beyond keeping him alive through the night. Now, the possibility that her choice could ripple through the war felt almost unreal. They stayed in the cabin until midday, the general regaining enough strength to stand without her support. Outside, the winter sun hung low, casting long shadows over the snow. Then, faintly at first, came the sound of distant musket fire. It swelled, then faded, followed by the echo of a horn. The general straightened, listening. "That's ours," he said, relief in his voice. They held the pass. Sarah felt her chest loosen for the first time in hours. When they finally walked back toward the valley, the general carried himself with the dignity of a man returning to his duty. At the edge of the woods, he stopped and turned to her. "I'll see to it you're remembered for this," he said. "They called you too weak to survive the war. History will say otherwise." Sarah didn't answer. She just pulled her shawl tighter, the wind carrying away the smoke of a battle she had never meant to be part of, but would never forget.